I wasn't supposed to be home that night. My flight out of Chicago got delayed by 6 hours, and with a full day of meetings behind me and another delay expected, I decided to ditch the airport. Why torture myself on a plastic chair when I could be in my own bed? I called Melissa to let her know I'd be back sooner than expected, but the call went straight to voicemail. I didn't think much of it at the time. She probably muted her phone during one of her reality shows. When I pulled into the driveway, something felt off immediately. A dark gray BMW I didn't recognize was parked right in front of our garage. It wasn't a neighbor's car. I'd lived in that house long enough to know everyone's vehicles. My first thought was that it might belong to one of Melissa's friends. She had a habit of hosting her wine nights without warning me, so maybe this was just another one of her impromptu get-togethers. The house was dark, though. No lights in the living room, no faint glow from the kitchen, just the soft hum of the porch light. That should have been my first red flag, but I brushed it off. Maybe Melissa and her friend went to bed early, or they'd carpooled somewhere and left this car behind. Still, the feeling didn't go away. Something gnawed at me, a quiet, insistent buzz at the back of my mind. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of Melissa's favorite lavender candles, but beneath that, something else lingered. A faint whiff of cologne, unfamiliar and sharp. The kind of scent you'd smell on someone who wasn't me. I set my suitcase down quietly and stood there, listening. At first, there was nothing. Just the usual hum of the fridge and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, faintly, I heard it. Muffled laughter from upstairs. A man's voice and Melissa's giggle, unmistakable. My stomach dropped. I froze. 1,000 thoughts ran through my head at once, but none of them made sense. It felt like I was moving in slow motion as I kicked off my shoes, careful not to make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they'd hear it. I took the stairs one at a time, gripping the banister until my knuckles turned white. The voices became clearer with each step, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. Just the rhythm of their conversation, easy and intimate in a way that sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. When I reached the top, the door to our bedroom was closed, but the faint glow of a bedside lamp leaked out from underneath it. I stood there for a moment, staring at that door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I had to know. I pushed the door open, and there she was, tangled up in the sheets with some guy I'd never seen before. They froze when they saw me, Melissa scrambling to pull the blanket over herself, while the guy just smirked like he didn't have a care in the world. "David!" Melissa shrieked, her voice high and panicked. "It's not what it looks like." The guy, a tan, wiry man in his late 30s with a buzz cut, didn't even bother to cover himself. He just leaned back against the headboard like he owned the place. "I guess the flight got canceled, huh?" he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. I didn't even look at him. My eyes were locked on Melissa, her face flushed with equal parts shame and indignation. "It's exactly what it looks like," I said, my voice cold and steady, even though I felt anything but calm inside. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I turned to the guy. "Get dressed. Now." His smirk faltered, and he slowly reached for his pants. Melissa, meanwhile, started babbling incoherently, something about how it was a mistake and how she could explain everything. I didn't say another word. I just stood there, watching as the man gathered his clothes and made a clumsy exit, his smugness evaporating under my glare. When the front door slammed shut behind him, I turned back to Melissa. Her expression had shifted from panic to defiance, as though she were preparing for a fight. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded. She crossed her arms over the sheet, her voice trembling with anger instead of remorse. "I don't know why you're acting so self-righteous. You're never here, David. You're always on business trips or glued to your laptop when you are home." I was lonely. I stared at her, dumbfounded. "That's your excuse? I work my ass off to give us this life, and you repay me by screwing some guy in our bed? You don't understand," she shot back, her tone sharpening. "It's not just about sex, David. You've been distant for years. You don't care about me anymore." I could barely believe what I was hearing. This wasn't an apology, it was an attack. I'd walked in on her betrayal, and she had the audacity to make it my fault. I don't care about you? I repeated, my voice rising. Melissa, I've done nothing but care about you. I've sacrificed time, energy, everything to make you happy, and this is what you do. She rolled her eyes, as if I were being unreasonable. You don't get it. I don't expect you to. Something in me snapped. I wasn't going to stand there and let her twist this into something it wasn't. You're right, I said coldly. I don't get it, and I never will. I turned and walked out of the room, her protests following me down the stairs. I grabbed my keys and left the house, needing space, needing air. My hands were shaking as I drove aimlessly, the weight of what I'd just seen pressing down on me like a vice. This was only the beginning, but I already knew one thing for sure. Life as I knew it was over. I didn't go far that night, just parked in a random lot with the engine idling, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing holding me together. I couldn't process it, Melissa's lies, her indifference, the smirk on that guy's face. It was all too much. Eventually, I drove to a 24-hour diner, hoping a greasy burger and bad coffee might settle my nerves. The place was almost empty, just a couple of truckers and an older waitress who didn't even blink when I walked in looking like I'd just crawled out of a wreck. I sat in a corner booth and stared at the menu, but my appetite was gone. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Melissa. David, please come home. Let's talk about this. I can explain. I stared at the message, my chest tightening with anger and disbelief. Explain? What was there to explain? I'd seen everything I needed to see. Still, I didn't reply. Let her sit with it for a while. I stayed at the diner until my coffee went cold, replaying the scene over and over in my head. The guy's smug grin, Melissa's pathetic excuses, the sheer audacity of it all. My mind spiraled, jumping between anger and hurt, betrayal and disbelief. By the time I finally drove home, the sun was beginning to rise. The house was silent when I walked in. Melissa was sitting on the couch, still wrapped in the sheet from the night before. Her eyes were red and puffy like she'd been crying, but I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. David, she started, standing up as I closed the door. Can we please talk? I dropped my keys on the counter and leaned against it, crossing my arms. Start talking. She hesitated, wringing her hands. I didn't mean for you to find out like this. I've been unhappy for a long time and what? I snapped. You thought the solution was to bring some asshole into our bed while I was out working to pay for this house? Do you have any idea how pathetic that is? She flinched but quickly rallied, her tone turning defensive. Don't act like you're some saint, David. You're never here. You're always working late or flying off to meetings. I felt abandoned. Oh, spare me, I said, my voice ice cold. You're lonely, so you cheat? That's your excuse? How long has this been going on, Melissa? And don't lie to me. She looked away, her jaw tightening. A few months. A few months? I repeated, my voice rising. How many times has he been in my house? In my bed? Her silence told me everything I needed to know. My chest felt like it was going to explode. Unbelievable, I muttered, pacing the kitchen. I gave you everything, Melissa. Everything. And this is how you repay me? You think this is all my fault? She shot back, her voice rising to match mine. You're the one who checked out of this marriage years ago. You're the one who made me feel like I was invisible. I turned to face her, my anger boiling over. Checked out? I've been working my ass off to give you the life you wanted. The vacations, the house, the car, everything. And while I'm out busting my ass, you're here screwing some random guy. Don't you dare try to make this my fault. She folded her arms, glaring at me. His name is Matt, and he's not random. He understands me in ways you never did. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Matt, huh? Well, congratulations. You two deserve each other. I hope he's ready to support you, because I'm done. Melissa's expression faltered. Done? What do you mean? I mean, pack your things, I said, my voice deadly calm. You're not staying here. This is my house, and you are not welcome in it anymore. You can't be serious, she said, her voice trembling. David, we've been married for 10 years. You can't just throw me out. Watch me. She tried to argue, but I wasn't having it. I went upstairs, grabbed a suitcase from the closet, and tossed it at her feet. Start packing. Now. Where am I supposed to go? She asked, her voice breaking. I don't care. Call your boyfriend. I'm sure Matt will be thrilled to have you. For the first time that night, I saw real fear in her eyes. She realized I wasn't bluffing. She tried a different tactic, stepping closer and lowering her voice. David, please. Don't do this. We can fix this. I love you. I recoiled, laughing bitterly. Love me? If this is your idea of love, I'd hate to see what hate looks like. Her tears started again, but I was beyond caring. I watched as she packed a bag in silence, her movements stiff and mechanical. When she was done, I opened the door and gestured for her to leave. She paused in the doorway, her face a mess of anger, fear, and desperation. You'll regret this, David, she said softly. Not as much as you will, I replied, slamming the door behind her. That was the longest night of my life, but it wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Melissa thought she could lie her way out of this, but I wasn't done with her yet. Not even close. The silence in the house after Melissa left was deafening. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at nothing, letting the events of the night wash over me like cold waves. The anger hadn't faded, but something sharper, more insidious, crept in. Questions? Who was Matt, really? How long had Melissa been sneaking him into my house, into my life? And was this her first affair, or just the first one I'd caught? I didn't sleep. Instead, I poured myself a stiff drink and opened my laptop. If Melissa was bold enough to flaunt her affair in my bed, there was no telling what else she'd left behind. I started digging, determined to unearth every last detail. It didn't take long to find something. Melissa had been careless, leaving her email logged in on my browser. I clicked through her messages, my hands shaking with a mix of dread and fury. Most were harmless, but then I found a folder marked work stuff. Inside were dozens of emails exchanged with Matt Taylor, a name that quickly turned my stomach. He wasn't just her lover. He was her colleague. The emails were a mixture of flirtation, plans for rendezvous, and, to my disgust, schemes. David's gone again. It's like I'm married to a ghost. Can't wait to see you tonight. Hugs and kisses. I told him I was at a conference last weekend. He didn't even question it. Too busy with his precious job. It wasn't just sex. It was calculated deceit. But the email that broke me came from Matt himself. You've got to make a decision, Melissa. I'm not going to keep sneaking around. I want you, but I won't wait forever. Once you're free, we can finally move on. It wasn't about finances or practicality. It was clear Matt wanted Melissa for himself, regardless of the consequences. He wasn't some desperate opportunist leeching off my hard work. No, he had everything he needed. He was just arrogant enough to think he could step into my life, take what he wanted, and walk away unscathed. I spent the rest of the morning collecting evidence. I took screenshots of every email, forwarded them to my personal account, and made backups on a secure drive. If Melissa thought she could blindside me in divorce court, she had another thing coming. But that wasn't enough. I needed more, proof so damning that neither she nor Matt could spin their way out of it. That's when an idea struck me. I opened Facebook and searched for Matt Taylor. His profile was public, and it didn't take long to find something interesting. He was married. His wife's name was Amanda, and based on the happy family photos littering his page, she had no idea what was going on. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was stepping into dangerous territory. Then I thought about Matt's smirk, about Melissa's lies, about the emails where they plotted my humiliation. They didn't deserve my restraint. I took screenshots of Matt's profile and his wife's information, then drafted a message. To Amanda Taylor. Hi Amanda. I'm sorry to reach out like this, but I think you deserve to know the truth. My name is David, and I'm married to Melissa, your husband Matt's coworker. Last night, I came home unexpectedly and found them together in my bed. I don't know if this is the first time Matt has done something like this, but I have evidence that this affair has been going on for months. I've attached screenshots of emails between them and photos proving their relationship. I'm truly sorry to bring this to you, but I thought you deserved to know. If you want to talk more, let me know. Again, I'm sorry. I hit send, my heart racing. It felt like I just dropped a match into a pool of gasoline, but I couldn't bring myself to regret it. If Matt and Melissa wanted to play dirty, I could play dirtier. By mid-afternoon, Amanda replied. Subject: thank you. David: thank you for telling me. I had no idea this was happening. I don't even know what to say right now. I'm furious and heartbroken. Can we talk? I want to make sure they don't get away with this. Her message was brief, but laced with raw emotion. I called her immediately, and we spent an hour piecing together their lies. Amanda confirmed that Matt had been leaving their home for work trips and staying late at the office far more often than usual. She'd even noticed odd charges for dinners and gifts, but had brushed them off as part of his professional life. We agreed on one thing. Neither of them could walk away unscathed. The first part of our plan was simple. Amanda promised to confront Matt that evening, blindsiding him before he had a chance to strategize with Melissa. Meanwhile, I prepared my next move, serving Melissa with divorce papers and ensuring she couldn't touch a dime of my money. But I wasn't done yet. Public exposure was my next goal. Melissa and Matt had made a mockery of my trust, and it was time for everyone else to see them for who they really were. And I had the perfect opportunity to make it happen. That night, I received a text from Amanda. I confronted him. He denied it at first, but when I showed him the emails, he finally admitted it. He said he fell in love with Melissa but claimed it's not what it looks like. What a joke. He's staying at a hotel tonight. Let's make them pay. For the first time all day, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Melissa and Matt thought they could control the narrative, but we just ripped it out of their hands. The pieces were falling into place. Soon, their entire world would come crashing down. The morning after Melissa left, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity. I knew this wasn't the end. Melissa wasn't the type to accept consequences without resistance. But for the first time, I felt a sliver of control creeping back into my life. After a quick coffee, I called my lawyer, Elise. I laid out everything: the affair, the emails, the months of lies. Elise listened carefully, her tone professional but firm. David, you're in a solid position here. With the evidence you've collected, we can move forward with the divorce under adultery. Melissa won't have much of a case for contesting. And the house? I asked. Elise didn't hesitate. It's in your name, and you've been the sole earner. She doesn't have much of a claim. We'll make sure that's protected. Her confidence gave me a sense of relief. For months, Melissa had been unraveling my life behind the scenes. Now, I was finally in a position to secure what mattered most. I spent the day preparing for what was ahead. Every email, every text, every moment of proof. I made sure Elise had it all. As I worked, I couldn't help but reflect on the years I'd spent with Melissa. The vacations, the anniversaries, the countless nights we'd sat together planning our future. It felt like another lifetime. Like those memories belonged to someone else entirely. That afternoon, Melissa called. Her name flashed on my screen, and for a moment, I debated ignoring it. But I knew she'd keep trying until I answered. What do you want, Melissa? I said, keeping my voice cold and even. We need to talk, she replied, her tone sharp. This whole thing has gotten out of hand. I couldn't help but laugh. Out of hand? Melissa, you cheated on me. You lied to my face for months. What exactly is there to talk about? She bristled at my response. You're not listening. We've been together for 10 years, David. Don't you think that means something? Don't you think we owe it to ourselves to at least try to fix this? I felt a flicker of disbelief. Even now, after everything, she was trying to rewrite the story, to cast herself as the victim and me as the one who had failed her. No, I said firmly. We don't owe each other anything anymore. You made your choice, Melissa. Now you have to live with it. She was quiet for a moment before her voice turned icy. Fine. If that's how you want to play it, I'll see you in court. But don't think for a second that I'm walking away empty-handed. I hung up without another word. Her arrogance didn't surprise me anymore. It was just another part of who she'd become. But her threat lingered in my mind. I knew she'd fight to get what she could, but Elise had already assured me the law was on my side. The following day, Melissa was officially served with divorce papers. She called me immediately, her voice a mix of fury and desperation. "You're really doing this?" she spat. "You're really going to throw away everything we've built together?" "You threw it away," I said calmly. "I'm just cleaning up the mess." Her response was a string of accusations. How I'd ignored her. How I'd forced her into the affair by being distant. None of it was new. Melissa had been rewriting reality for months, and I wasn't going to play along anymore. "I'm done talking about this," I said, cutting her off. "If you have something to say, talk to my lawyer." Her response was a scoff before she hung up. Days blurred together as the fallout from Melissa's betrayal settled over my life like a heavy fog. It wasn't the paperwork or the silence that got to me. It was the memories. The realization that the woman I thought I'd been building a life with had been dismantling it behind my back. Everywhere I turned, I saw reminders of her. The vase she insisted we buy from that little shop on the coast. The throw blanket she loved, still draped over the couch. Even the damn coffee maker in the kitchen, which she swore by despite its tendency to sputter and spill. It was as if every object in the house had absorbed a piece of her, taunting me with echoes of the person I'd thought she was. One night, unable to sleep, I opened an old photo album. It was filled with snapshots of our life together. Vacations, anniversaries, lazy Sunday mornings with her curled up on the couch. I lingered on one picture from a trip to Colorado, where we'd rented a cabin in the mountains. Melissa's smile was wide and carefree, her arms slung around my shoulders as we stood in front of a roaring fire. Looking at it now, it felt hollow. How much of it had been real? How much of her joy had been genuine? And how much had been her playing a part? I closed the album and shoved it back into the drawer. Dwelling on the past wasn't helping. One of the hardest parts was the reaction from people who knew us. Word about the divorce spread quickly among our circle, though I hadn't gone out of my way to share details. Some friends were supportive, checking in with kind words or offers to grab a drink. Others, mutual acquaintances of Melissa and me, were more hesitant. One call in particular stuck with me. It was from Vanessa, a friend Melissa had known since college. I can't believe this is happening," Vanessa said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Melissa always talked about how much she loved you." "Yeah," I said flatly, gripping the phone tighter. She had a funny way of showing it. Vanessa was quiet for a moment before adding, "Look, I don't want to take sides, but are you sure this is really the end? Maybe you two can work it out." I didn't bother hiding my frustration. Vanessa, she cheated on me. For months. In my own house. There's no working that out. The line went quiet, and I could feel Vanessa trying to find the right words. "I'm sorry, David. I didn't mean to upset you." "It's fine," I said, though it wasn't. "I need to go." Calls like that reminded me of how many people didn't see Melissa for who she truly was. They saw the version of her she wanted them to see. Charming, funny, loving. They hadn't seen the lies, the betrayal, the way she'd manipulated me for months. That weekend, I decided to start clearing out the house. Box by box, I packed away the things that reminded me of her. Some items I donated, others I set aside for her to pick up whenever she got around to it. With each box I sealed, it felt like I was reclaiming a small piece of my life. One box, though, stopped me cold. It was filled with old cards and letters she'd written to me over the years. Anniversary notes, little love letters she'd slipped into my suitcase when I traveled for work. "I can't wait for you to come home. I miss you every second you're gone. You're my rock, my safe place. I don't know what I'd do without you." The words felt like acid on my skin. I wanted to throw the box into the trash, to purge her lies from my life completely. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. Instead, I shoved the box into the back of the closet, where I wouldn't have to look at it. The house was starting to feel emptier, but not in a bad way. Without her things cluttering the space, it was easier to breathe. Easier to imagine a life without her in it. One night, as I sat on the couch with a beer in hand, I realized something. I didn't miss her. Not the real her, anyway. I missed the idea of her, the person I thought she was. But that person didn't exist anymore, if she ever had. It was a sobering thought, but it brought me a strange sense of peace. The weight of the past was still there, but it didn't feel as crushing as it had before. Slowly but surely, I was moving forward. The process wasn't easy, and I knew there were more hard days ahead. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could see a way out of the darkness. Melissa had taken a lot from me, but she hadn't taken everything. And that, I realized, was enough to start rebuilding. I was in the middle of sorting through another stack of old papers when the doorbell rang. I froze for a moment, expecting a delivery, but when I glanced through the peephole, my stomach clenched. It was Melissa. She stood on the porch, wearing a fitted jacket and jeans, looking as if she had stepped out for a casual coffee date. Her face carried none of the desperation I'd seen before. Instead, she looked composed, almost determined. I considered ignoring her, but I knew she wouldn't leave. With a sigh, I opened the door. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice cold. She smiled faintly, as if trying to diffuse the tension. "Can we talk? Just for a minute." "No," I replied, starting to close the door. "David, please," she said quickly, her tone softening. "I just want to clear the air. I know I messed up, okay? But I think we should have a conversation like adults." I hesitated, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, but another part of me wanted to hear what she had to say. "5 minutes," I said, stepping aside. "Then you leave." She walked in slowly, her eyes scanning the house. It was clear she noticed the changes, her belongings gone, the furniture rearranged, the spaces that used to hold traces of her now empty. "It looks different," she said softly, almost to herself. "It's not your home anymore," I replied. "What do you want, Melissa?" She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," she began. "About us. And I know I can't undo what I've done, but I don't think we should end things like this. We had 10 years together, David. That has to count for something." I stared at her, incredulous. "You're seriously standing here asking me to consider what we had after everything you've done?" Her composure faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't want us to hate each other. I don't want this to get ugly." I laughed bitterly. "It's already ugly, Melissa. You made sure of that the second you brought Matt into my house. And now you're worried about being hated? Unbelievable." She took a step closer, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you, David, but we're both hurting, aren't we? Don't you think it's better if we try to find some kind of peace?" "Peace," I said, shaking my head. "You don't want peace, Melissa. You want to salvage whatever you can to make yourself feel better. This isn't about me or us. It's about your guilt." Her face hardened. "That's not true. I'm trying to do the right thing here." "No," I said firmly. "If you wanted to do the right thing, you would have left me before you started sleeping with someone else. You don't get to rewrite the story now that it's convenient for you." The room went quiet, the weight of my words settling between us. Melissa shifted on her feet, her confidence visibly wavering. "Is that really how you see me?" she asked quietly. "It's how you've shown yourself to be," I replied. "If you wanted a different ending, you should have made different choices." She looked away, her jaw tightening. For a moment, I thought she might say something else, but instead, she picked up her bag and headed for the door. Before she stepped out, she turned back to me, her expression a mix of anger and sadness. "You'll regret this, David. Someday, you'll see that I was right about us." I didn't reply. I just watched as she walked out, closing the door behind her. After she left, I stood there for a long time, letting the silence of the house settle around me. Her words rang in my ears, but they didn't hold the power they once might have. For years, I'd let Melissa dictate how I felt, how I saw myself, how I lived my life. But standing there in the quiet of my home, I realized something. Her influence over me was gone. Whatever regret or closure she was looking for, she wouldn't find it here. She had made her choices, and now, so had I. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of relief. The door wasn't just closed on Melissa, it was locked. And this time, I wasn't looking back. The days after Melissa's visit felt quieter, almost surreal. For the first time in what seemed like forever, there were no calls, no texts, no unexpected appearances. It was as if her parting words had been her final attempt to control the situation, and when that failed, she retreated entirely. I welcomed the silence. It gave me space to think, to breathe, to start rebuilding. Work became my anchor. I threw myself into it, taking on new projects, volunteering for extra responsibilities, and reconnecting with colleagues I'd unintentionally drifted away from during my marriage. It was a distraction at first, but eventually, it felt like something more. I was good at my job, and focusing on it reminded me that I was more than the mess Melissa had left behind. I also started reconnecting with friends. At first, I hesitated, unsure how much I wanted to share about the divorce. But to my surprise, most of them were supportive, especially my best friend, Greg. I knew something was off with Melissa, Greg said one evening over beers. The way she acted at parties, the little digs she'd make about you. I didn't want to say anything, though. Figured it wasn't my place. I shook my head, smiling ruefully. You should have said something. Might have saved me a lot of trouble. Greg raised his glass. Well, you're out of it now. That's what matters. Here's to moving on. To moving on, I echoed, clinking my glass against his. Moving on wasn't just about work and friends, though. I'd started going to the gym again, something I hadn't done consistently since the early years of my marriage. At first, it was about channeling the anger, the raw, seething energy that came from betrayal. But over time, it became something else, a routine, a way to take care of myself. I'd let so much of myself slip away during my marriage, constantly putting Melissa's needs and desires ahead of my own. Now, I was rediscovering what it meant to prioritize myself. One evening, as I was clearing out more of Melissa's things, I stumbled across a photo tucked into the back of a drawer. It was of us on our wedding day, standing on a sunlit lawn, surrounded by family and friends. Her smile was radiant, her eyes bright with joy. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman in the picture with the one who had lied to me, cheated on me, and tried to gaslight me into thinking it was my fault. Eventually, I slipped the photo into an envelope and placed it with the other items I planned to return to her. It was a piece of my past, but it didn't belong in my future. The divorce proceedings moved along faster than I expected, thanks in large part to Elise's meticulous preparation. Melissa barely contested anything, likely realizing she didn't have a leg to stand on. When the final papers came through, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and an odd sense of freedom. I sat with the papers in my hands for a while, letting it sink in. My marriage was officially over, but so was the pain of it. One night, Greg invited me to a small gathering at his place. It was nothing fancy, just a few beers, a grill, and some friends I hadn't seen in years. At one point, I found myself talking to a woman named Harper. She was smart, funny, and refreshingly down to earth. We chatted for hours, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about Melissa. As the night wound down, Harper handed me her number with a smile. No pressure, she said, but I'd love to grab coffee sometime. I hesitated for a moment, then smiled back. I'd like that. Driving home that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. My life wasn't perfect, and I still had a lot of healing to do. But for the first time, I could see the pieces starting to come together. Melissa's betrayal had broken me in ways I didn't think were possible, but it hadn't destroyed me. I was still standing, and I was ready to keep moving forward. The weeks following the finalization of the divorce were liberating in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the absence of Melissa or the constant tension that had surrounded our marriage. It was the freedom to create a life that was mine, without compromise or pretense. One of the first things I did was take a trip, a solo journey I'd been putting off for years. For as long as I could remember, I wanted to visit the Pacific Northwest. The towering forests, the rocky coastlines, the endless expanse of green. It always felt like the kind of place where someone could start over. Standing on a windswept beach in Oregon, I felt the weight of the last few months lift. The air was sharp and cold, the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks soothing. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about the past. I spent the rest of the trip hiking, exploring small towns, and rediscovering what it felt like to be alone. Not lonely, but content in my own company. When I returned home, I threw myself into making my house feel like my home. Melissa's things were long gone, but the space still carried traces of her. The floral curtains she'd chosen, the art she'd insisted on hanging in the living room, the furniture she'd picked out, all of it felt foreign now. I started small, repainting the walls in colors that felt more like me: deep blues, warm grays, earthy greens. I replaced the old couch with one that didn't sag in the middle and swapped the generic wall art for photos I'd taken on my trip. Each change, no matter how small, felt like reclaiming a part of myself. One day, as I was reorganizing the garage, I stumbled across a box I hadn't seen in years. Inside were old journals I'd kept in my 20s, long before Melissa came into the picture. I flipped through them, smiling at the younger version of myself who dreamed big and wrote with unfiltered optimism. It was strange, reading those pages and realizing how much of that person I'd lost over the years. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped dreaming, stopped believing in the kind of life I once thought was possible. I closed the journal and sat there for a moment, letting the memories wash over me. Then I picked up a pen and started writing again. Greg, ever the optimist, was thrilled to hear I'd gone out with Harper a few times. "She seems like a good one," he said one evening as we grabbed drinks after work. "She's great," I admitted, "but I'm not rushing into anything. I still have a lot to figure out." Greg nodded, raising his glass. "You're taking your time. That's good. Just don't let the past hold you back too much. Not everyone's Melissa." I chuckled, clinking my glass against his. "I know, and I'm not letting the past win. I'm just making sure I do things right this time." Harper and I continued seeing each other casually. She was understanding, patient, and didn't push for more than I was ready to give. It was refreshing to be with someone who was honest and upfront, someone who didn't hide behind layers of manipulation and deceit. One evening, as we sat on a park bench watching the sunset, she turned to me and said, "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" I nodded, not bothering to hide the truth. "Yeah, it's been a rough year." She smiled softly. "Well, for what it's worth, I think you're doing okay. Better than okay. Actually." Her words stayed with me long after I dropped her off that night. The healing process wasn't linear. There were still moments when I'd catch myself replaying old arguments in my head, wondering if there had been something I could have done differently. But those moments grew fewer and farther between. With each passing day, I felt stronger, more certain of who I was and what I wanted. Melissa's betrayal had been a painful wake-up call, but it had also given me the push I needed to reclaim my life. One afternoon, as I was tidying up the house, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "David, it's Melissa. Can we talk? I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I'd really like to clear the air." I stared at the message for a long moment, a strange calm settling over me. I didn't feel anger or sadness, just indifference. Without hesitation, I deleted the message and went back to what I was doing. Melissa was part of my past, and that's where she was going to stay. My future, I realized, was entirely up to me now, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.